Okay, welcome to lecture 11. So this is actually the second to last lecture. So we'll have one more after this. And so this week we're going to talk about motivation or teacher motivation. And just to get started, so generally when we think about teachers, we generally think about their enthusiasm, how that actually affects the students. And so it's actually been found that that's actually one of the most important factors for motivating students. Not much has been done though, looking at how much or the how what motivates teachers essentially. Okay, so we see more in terms of research into this in like general educational psychology, but we haven't really seen much of it in second language studies. Okay. Um, anyway, so um, yeah, so basically when we think about teacher motivation, we're focused on three areas. So we have career choice among the teachers. So what made them choose that? Complexities during the teaching process. So what goes on in the classroom while they're teaching, and then factors impacting development of teachers and students. Okay, so what is having an impact in learner development and like teacher development in terms of like their pedagogy practices and whatnot. Okay. So when we think about teacher motivation, we want to kind of define motivation to teach. So how do we conceptualize this? And so normally what we think about is we look at these different theories that we've talked about already, and we kind of apply them here as well. Okay, so we have expectancy value theory again, self-efficacy theory, goal setting, goal orientation, and self-determination theory. Okay, so these are all things that you should all be familiar with by now. And they have just as much impact on the teacher as they do on students. Okay, and in addition, so we also, like with students, we also have these influences from the social and contextual factors. They're different in a way, but they still have a really strong influence. And actually, these are where a lot of the you'll find that a lot of the negative influences on teacher motivation come from the social and contextual factors. Okay, so when we think about teacher motivation, we have four motivational aspects that we focus on. So we have the intrinsic component, the contextual factors, the temporal factors, and then fragility, basically. So how fragile is there? What are the negative factors, essentially, that come into play? Okay, so if we first look at the intrinsic component, then, so basically, oftentimes when you read studies that are surveying teachers, they have many of the teachers will say that they have a very strong intrinsic component to why they decided to learn or to study education. Okay, so a lot of times they'll say they have an internal desire to educate people. They want to impart knowledge and values. They want to advance the community or nation, and they want to make a social contribution. So these are all things that they have like inside them that they want to do, and they're often more focused on the intrinsic rewards. So these can be the education process itself. So what do they do in the classroom? What are the outcomes from what they do in the classroom? It can also be based on the subject matter. So if they're really interested in the subject matter and they feel like they can express that enthusiasm, then they feel like that's a reward in itself, and so that keeps them going. And so, like we've talked about before, like these more intrinsic components. So when we talk about like self-determination theory, the things that are more on the integrated end, these are going to be things that have a stronger force in motivating an individual. Okay, so basically you can think of like the teacher, their main motivation is coming from this intrinsic component. Okay, so we can think about it in terms of like psychological needs. Okay, so the three basic psychological needs that we have are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So with autonomy is obviously, so you're independent, you're able to do things on your own. Relatedness is you have like a support group or people around you. Okay, and then competence is kind of your self-efficacy. Okay, so how competent do you think you are? How able do you think you are? Okay, so often when we think about teaching, it actually satisfies the first two. So as a teacher, you're for the most part autonomous. You have control in your classroom. You can do kind of more or less what you want. You can achieve the objectives in any way that you want. And then you have a community. So you have the students themselves, and you also have your other colleagues around you, and then the administration and things too. So you have the autonomy and the relatedness. Competence is, confidence comes in teaching with the personal efficacy. Okay, so we think about whether or not teachers feel competent or feel able in their abilities. So generally, what we think of then is teaching is motivating when it's meaningful. Okay, so is there some sort of value behind it? So going back to expectancy value theory. Autonomy is allowed, so they have freedom to do what they want in the classroom in order to achieve, as long as they achieve the objectives, and they have some sort of feedback. Okay, so they can see feedback in terms of the success that the students have based on their teaching methods, or from other colleagues who might like observe them and give them some feedback, or from administrators as well. Okay. So, I mean, those are all things that we think of when we look at the intrinsic component. And then when we get to the contextual factors, we have these are the things that play more of a role in the intrinsic motivation. So generally, these can be where you make or break the teacher, kind of. So performance of the teacher is actually affected by work and not the worker, meaning that it comes from outside, not from inside. So generally, the contextual factors and these other factors that we'll talk about, they can often kind of wear down on that intrinsic component a little bit. And over time, that if it wears down enough, it leads to demotivation in teachers. Okay, so we have two main categories for contextual factors. We have school-based, and then we have systemic or society level. So school-based would be like school leadership and workload. So is the leadership competent? Are they good leaders, or are they just kind of like bossing you around, trying to get things done without really showing any sort of example? Is the workload reasonable, or are you expected to do more than what you are actually, or what you should be expected to be able to do? And then the systemic would be like status. So as a teacher, we often see people say like, you're well, and it's kind of true too. So as a teacher, you don't really have that high of a status. Okay, so you're not, you don't have a high status or social image among people. So I mean, we don't often, as a teacher, we don't often go into it for the image, I guess. So we go for in for it more for the same factors that we just talked about, the intrinsic factors before. So you want to make a difference in the world, kind of. So these are all these things can actually, and unfortunately, can often have a negative, or more often than not, negative in nature, and so they have kind of a negative effect on the intrinsic motivation. So we also have temporal factors. So this is kind of discussed in terms of careers. So over the time, so teaching is actually a career. It's basically your full life. And Doherty and Ushio talk about the difference between closed and open career. So open careers have this idea like there's a ladder that you can go up, and it kind of keeps going and going. With closed careers, you kind of get to a certain rung and it's done. Okay, so it kind of all plateaus off. And so teaching is often considered a closed career. And so this kind of has a negative impact on morale for the teachers, which we'll discuss a little bit more later. But generally speaking, there's only so far you can go. So most of the time, teachers will get to the point where they've taught for 10 years. They get their, like, if this is like in public school, when they taught for 10 years, they get like their tenure kind of, and then they don't really have anywhere else to go. They're teaching the same classes constantly. They don't really get much of a chance to do anything else. So it actually has a negative impact because they kind of see it as like they're not going anywhere. They've kind of reached their peak in a way. So like some people have made suggestions for this. So you can make a career ladder by increasing the variety of classes. So allowing teachers to actually make new courses, or allowing them to teach different classes that are offered. Allow contribution to the curriculum development. So let them have a say in the curriculum. So allow them to monitor new faculty, develop new courses, make presentations. So allow them the chance to do research and actually present it to their colleagues and to maybe even at conferences. Serve as a consultant, and then so allowing them to like actually conduct workshops. So once a teacher becomes experienced enough, they should be able to actually impart their wisdom that they've acquired to other newer teachers. And so allowing them to do that actually makes them feel more wanted in a way. It makes them feel like they have more of a purpose. Also, developing materials. So they should be allowed the chance to take the materials that they've been using and actually maybe make some new ones. So all of this basically boils down to the fact that these are all kind of strategies that allow the teacher to feel more useful, and it makes them feel like they can like they can go somewhere, like they're not just doing the same thing day in and day out. So we can talk about other negative influences then. So this is the fragility category that we talked about. So teaching is a very stressful job. So this is probably the major negative influence that it has. So most of the time is spent with groups of children or young adults or even adults. And a lot of times those students can be rebellious or have behavioral problems. So if you're a teacher, you have to deal with all of that. Students can be immature. They can be irresponsible. So you constantly have to like remind them of what to do. You have to kind of micromanage a lot. And as a teacher, you don't really get into the business of teaching to micromanage things. So it can actually wear down on you a lot, and it adds a lot of effort on your part. And it makes you it makes you stressed and frustrated at the same time. And so it can actually lead to burnout after a while. So if you have a lot of stress, you can only manage it for so long before it starts wearing away at your body physically. And then you just become exhausted and you can't really deal with anything anymore. So that's a major impact on teaching. So oftentimes we'll see like teachers will actually use some of these strategies, which aren't necessarily the greatest, but it's a way for them to kind of like regulate what they're experiencing and deal with it. So they'll find a way to like depersonalize individual students. So basically avoiding giving students special treatment. They'll develop detachment or cynical attitudes towards teaching, or towards like a specific group of students even. They'll rely on ritualized task performance. So this is kind of a way to make it so they don't have to think on their feet as much. Okay, so if you've ever been in the teaching experience, you can try and plan what's going to happen, but it's never going to go that way. So you have to kind of always be ready for what's going to come your way. And so a way that teachers who are stressed will deal with this is they will ritualize the task performance so they can have more of an idea of what's going to happen. Okay, so the more ritualized it is, the less surprises there and the less stress there's going to be. And then, yeah, so avoidance of change. So they don't want to change anything around. They want to do the same thing all the time. Okay, so basically this comes down to the fact that teachers need an adequate environment in order to reduce stress. So they need to have smaller class sizes. The classrooms need to be well equipped, and things like that. They need to have updated material, so that includes textbooks, handouts, anything like that. Different equipment that you have, so like computer programs, for instance, maybe. Reasonable responsibility. So don't like making it so teachers aren't expected to like work 80-hour weeks. It's kind of unreasonable to expect that, especially considering the pay that most teachers get. It's not, by having them do so much, it kind of is demeaning almost. And then the moral support that they need. So they need moral support from other people, other colleagues, and they need moral support from the administration. Okay, so these are all things that need to be in place in the environment that the teacher is working in to help reduce stress in a healthy way. Okay, so that. So other negative influences. So a lot of times we see restrictions in autonomy, especially with standardized tests from the government and schools. And so this actually leads to more controlling teachers. So because they have less autonomy, they actually start to control things a lot more. So it becomes less student-centered and more teacher-centered. Okay, it becomes less fun in that way too. Insufficient self-efficacy. So new teachers have limited classroom experience. Okay, so as a student in an education program, we often see people are more focused on the subject matter that they're going to be teaching rather than the actual teaching practices. So when they actually get into the teaching classroom, it's kind of like being thrown in the deep end. They don't know what to do. because they haven't had those experiences. So this also leads to stress in a way. It leads to it hits them so hard that it can actually kind of weaken their intrinsic interest in teaching, and so it can actually lead them to adopt more authoritarian approaches as well. So this is same reason before, looking at stress. They want to avoid surprises, essentially. Okay, and then the lack of an intellectual challenge. So often as teachers, we end up teaching the same thing over and over again, and it gets really old after a while. It's nice because, I mean, you have all the materials there. You can kind of tweak things. It gives you a chance to do that. But after like 10 years of teaching the same thing, you kind of get sick of it. So they get tired of the job they're doing after a while, essentially. And they always teaching the same thing. And then also, so the lack of a career structure, it leads to the idea of futurelessness. So they don't really feel like they have anywhere they're going. They feel like they're at their peak again, so they don't have a future. Okay, so these are all things that kind of have an impact. So teachers kind of come in with like this intrinsic interest, and then all these contextual and temporal and negative influences come into play that can kind of wear them down after a while. Okay. And we see this happen a lot. So a lot of teachers end up saying like they're not motivated to teach anymore because of these influences. So there's been a lot of research on teacher motivation. Pennington did a survey, so finding that advancement and compensation were the lowest rated aspects of job satisfaction, basically. So yeah, so you see this aspect of career once again. So teachers aren't happy with it. And they're also not happy with how much they're paid. You often hear teachers complain about how much they do and how little their pay is. And I mean, it's kind of true. So teachers, they're not only dealing with things in the classroom, they have to take their work home with them every night. They have to plan out lessons, they have to grade. They have to attend meetings during the day sometimes. It's a very thankless job, people often say. And I mean, it's true to an extent. So, I mean, compensation is definitely something that's out there that people are not happy with. And then we have a lack of respect. So status symbol again. So teaching isn't really very high up there in terms of status. Teachers are kind of disappointed by that a little bit, especially considering all the work they do. And then you have also the mandated curriculum. So teachers hate the mandated curriculum, especially in the form of standardized tests. So, I mean, you see recently, I think in the news, you see a lot of people trying to opt their children out of taking standardized tests. And so, I mean, this is part of the reason, so it's something that affects the teacher's ability to be autonomous in the classroom. So the more standardized tests there are, the more they have to focus on those instead of the rest of the curriculum, and they have to kind of change their teaching style to something that they wouldn't normally use. And so they're unhappy with that. And then Shoaib provides an extensive list of areas where changes can be made. I'm not going to go through that, but you can kind of look through that on pages 180 through 181. She gives a lot of examples. So if anybody here plans on doing anything with like administration, take a look at that article and that section in the textbook, because it's going to be, I mean, that's something that needs to be considered in programs. And then, so finally, we also have Kubaniova. So she actually looked at teacher motivation and kind of applied the L2 motivational self system here to it. Okay, so she looks at the ideal language teacher self. Okay, so kind of that intrinsic component. Okay, so where the teachers, or so the intrinsic interest that has driven the teachers to become a language teacher. You have the ought to language teacher self. Okay, so those are the contextual and the career influences and the other negative influences that come into play. And then you have the feared language teacher self. So obviously where you fear yourself going, and so you want to avoid going. Okay, so she found that teachers use input and develop practices when, so the input and the pedagogical principles are similar to their own intrinsic motives. Okay, so they say when they see that their own motives are match the input that they get from other people and the like maybe some sort of like if they attend a workshop for like a pedagogical practice that's been developed and it matches their intrinsic motives, they're more likely to use that. Okay. They're also more likely to use it when they recognize the disconnect between their current and desired end state, so that gap there again. Okay, so they have to recognize it and they have to actually be motivated to reduce it. Okay, so that third one there, sometimes teachers just don't care, especially if they've been teaching for a long time and they've just been worn down. If they've been worn down enough, they're not going to care about reducing the gap. They're just going to want to get through their day-to-day lives and finish. Okay. So those are the things that all kind of depend on how much the teacher is going to be motivated to continue to develop. Okay. And finally, we have other issues. So the native and non-native speaker thing here. So non-native speakers often find themselves kind of they feel at a disadvantage. So they feel less they have a lower self-efficacy rating because they view themselves as non-experts in English or some other language that they are speaking. Okay, so in this case, you see non-native speakers will often be a little bit less motivated. They'll have trouble getting their motivation to teach because of that. And the same thing is actually happening with native speakers now. With in English, for instance, with like global English varieties, they kind of feel pressure to take into account all these different varieties, and it is kind of overwhelming at the same time, and they feel at a disadvantage because they don't know all those different varieties. Okay, and then the final thing we're going to talk about here is the teacher and student motivation. So the relationship between the two. Okay. So teacher expectations can lead to a change in behavioral and learning outcomes. So if a teacher is less motivated or they kind of come in with assumptions about a group of students, it's going to affect learning outcomes. So they can actually treat certain students. So if they think that certain students are more motivated, they can actually treat them differently than others, for instance, even though they might not have an actual difference there. It's all about how they perceive the learners. And so that preferential treatment will actually lead to differences in learning outcomes. And we talked about enthusiasm earlier, and so we see a study mentioned here. So enthusiastic teachers are often the most remembered by students, and so that's because they make the subject matter infectious. And it actually is a really positive thing to have, because if they come in and are enthusiastic and committed to teaching those students, it actually lasts beyond the immediate classroom. So they found that. So I can't remember who did the study, but it was found that so the students actually, if they had an enthusiastic teacher, they actually maintain their enthusiasm for a subject. Like they could maintain it to the next semester, for instance. And so it kind of goes from teacher to teacher. So as long as the teachers are enthusiastic, the students will also be inspired to be enthusiastic about the material. Okay. Okay, so that ends the lecture for this week. So for next week, you have the Skype meetings. Be sure that you send me your materials the day before. If you don't send me the materials the day before, I will cancel the meeting, and you will have your final grade of your paper reduced. Okay, so make sure you do that. Okay. Let's see. And then for the following week, you'll read the Dornier and Uchiha chapter 8, and then I'll upload Dornier chapter 5. You'll read both of those. Chapter 8 is a little bit short. I think you probably want to focus more on chapter 5, but do look at chapter 8 a little bit. And then, yeah, so for this week and next week, so the discussion post, that's going to be due not this Sunday, but the following Sunday. Okay. So that's it for now. And if you have any questions, you can email me. And feel free, if you have questions about your final paper before the Skype meeting, just please contact me and I'll answer your questions the best I can. Okay, so that's it. So have a good week, and I'll talk to you guys next week.